Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. You're joining in on the Preparing for Climate Extremes in the North Central Region webinar. This is the second webinar in the series Climate Change and Water for Agricultural Education for Extension Professionals. This webinar is provided by funding from the North Central Water Network. I'm Tyler Williams. I'm the Cropping Systems and Climate Extension Educator for Nebraska Extension, and I'm located here in balmy Lincoln, Nebraska today, so we'll take it. There's a team of individuals that are helping put this together. Laura Edwards has been heading up this group from South Dakota State. Hans Schmitz will be taking care of the logistics here of the webinar from Purdue. We also have Peter Tomlinson from Kansas State and Dennis Toddy of South Dakota State. So we have a good speaker and topic today. Before I introduce him, I want to tell everyone that if you missed the first webinar by Dennis Toddy, the South Dakota State climatologist, and Jeff Andreessen, Michigan State climatologist, the recording can be found at our webinar series webpage, climateagwater.wordpress.com. And you can also find there a date and speakers for the upcoming webinar number 3, which is on March 28th at 1 p.m. Central Time. And the focus on that will be climate impacts on water management. And we'll have Jonathan Aguilar from Kansas State and Jane Frankenberger from Purdue as our speakers for that. So hopefully everyone can join us for that one. I also want to mention that at the very end we'll have a few questions that pop up for evaluation. Then we'll also have time for Q&A at the end too. So once Gene's speaking, please plan to stick around for a couple extra minutes and take part in that. With that, I think I've rambled on enough, so I want to introduce our speaker today, Gene Takle. He's the Pioneer Hybrid Professor of Agronomy at Iowa State University, and he conducts his research in the areas of climate change and wind energy. He was the coordinating lead co-author on the agriculture chapter of the 2014 National Climate Assessment. He grew up on a farm in southwestern Minnesota, and he gained firsthand experience with raising livestock and poultry, as well as a diverse range of crops. He has his bachelor's in physics and math from Luther College, and a PhD in physics from Iowa State. So his current research relates to climate adaptation and the impact of utility-scale wind farms on agricultural crops. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Gene. Again, thank you for joining. If you have questions anytime along the way, please type them into the chat box. And we'll do the Q&A at the end as well as some evaluation questions. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Gene, and you can fill in the gaps.
Well, thank you, and good morning, everyone. So I've entitled this "Preparing for Climate Extremes in the North Central U.S." And I will be providing you with kind of an elevator speech that we typically give from the National Climate Assessment. We'll look at an overview of climate adaptation and look at some of extremes and trends, and also think about the short view and the long view, and then we'll take a look at climate visioning climate transformation in the central region. So the National Climate Assessment was the most comprehensive assessment of climate.
Gene, I think you need to share your screen.
Oh, I'm not sharing the screen. No, let me see. Here's our outline as I indicated. And so the National Climate Assessment, as I indicated, was a very comprehensive and thorough study of all aspects of the impact of climate change on the U.S. And the message is that there are basically 4 messages: that climate change is happening now. All Americans are feeling the effects of climate change. Then the assessment was really the most comprehensive review of U.S. climate impacts on the U.S., and it's mandated by Congress to be done every 5 years. And so that's the reason for it. And that the final message is that we do have opportunities to reduce our emissions of heat-trapping gases and to prepare for the effects of climate change, those that we know are now happening and require us to adapt. So excuse me here. In a nutshell, we can say, and you've certainly heard a lot more details from Dennis and Jeff, who are, by the way, real authorities on the climate in the north central region. I like to think of it this way. Dry areas will be becoming drier and hotter. Wet areas will be becoming wetter and more humid. And we can apply that also to periods. If we are in a region of the north central region that is already dry, those dry areas are going to be drier, but our dry periods, which we're used to, are going to be even drier and hotter. And wet periods are also going to be wetter and more humid. So we can apply that to both areas and to time periods. We can say that in the western part, and the U.S. National Climate Assessment was divided up into a Midwest region and a Great Plains region, and the Dakotas and Kansas and Nebraska were included in the Great Plains region. And so it overlaps, the north central region that you think of really overlaps two regions that were used in the Midwest Climate Assessment. So I've kind of taken a few items from both of those. In the western part, the rising temperatures are leading to increased demand for water and energy. In the western parts of the region, this will constrain development, stress natural resources, and increase competition for water. And these are not new, of course. You're already dealing with those. But it's clear that new agricultural practices will be needed to cope with the changes, these changing conditions. So previous adaptation strategies have not been enough, and we'll have to really consider new strategies. If we look in the eastern portion from Iowa on east, extreme rainfall events and flooding have really increased during the last century, and these trends are expected to increase, causing erosion, declining water quality, negative impacts on transportation, agriculture, human health, and infrastructure. And again, for our region in the eastern part, in the next few decades, longer growing seasons and rising carbon dioxide levels will increase yields for some crops, and but those benefits will be progressively offset by extreme events. So there have been some actually improved conditions for crop production in recent years, but those are not likely to continue, and that though we have had some adaptations options that have reduced some of the detrimental effects, in the long term the combined stresses associated with climate change are expected to decrease agricultural productivity. So we have to think about visioning what the landscape should look like in a future climate that is going to be exposed to these extremes. And I like this photo because it's a USDA photo that these cattle are looking directly at us to see what we have planned for the future. First of all, let's talk, just to review briefly the climate. We talk about climate change, we talk about climate variability. And we talk about climate change. This involves significant changes in the climate system over time periods ranging from decades to perhaps even climatologists think in terms of millions of years. Climate variability typically refers to inherent fluctuations within the climate system, and these are caused by influences such as sunspots and other natural variabilities dealing with the orbit of the Earth around the sun and so on. And so we are here talking about climate change that is introduced by both of these factors, both human and natural causes. But we know that the human causes are having a larger and larger impact on climate change generally. It's important that we think about these for agriculture because we have moved in the last 50 years to more specialization and intensification of our agricultural system. And what that's done is that has tightened the relationship between agriculture and climate. For instance, grazing and animal agriculture is practiced in areas where animal comfort and low disease potential exist naturally. That is, our natural services, ecological services, provide good opportunities for for raising cattle. And if that climate changes, then it reduces that animal comfort or increases disease potential. So, and similarly in where row crop agriculture is practiced, we raise crops that are well adapted to those particular climate factors, and if those change, of course, then it undermines this ability to have high productivity in these regions. Well, farmers are, of course, very familiar with the concept of adaptation. They adapt to a lot of things, and whether it's high weed populations or low seed germination or costs, external costs, and so on, and market fluctuations. These are everyday concerns for agriculture, but changing climate adds one more to this mix of needs for adaptation. And the changes that we've seen in the past 15 years, 20 years have in some cases been favorable, and farmers have adapted to this to increase their profitability. Higher summer rainfall has allowed for higher plant densities. When I grew up on the farm, we planted in southwestern Minnesota about 14 to 18,000 plants per acre, and then those same farms now, plant populations are up around probably 30, 35,000 plants per acre. So a huge increase, doubling almost of plant populations. A longer growing season also has been favorable. It's allowed for planting earlier, planting longer season hybrids, and the dry conditions in fall have led to more natural dry down, and the need for artificial drying of corn, for instance, is significantly reduced from what it was 40, 50 years ago. I'm going to talk a little bit about physiological limits. That is, we raise certain plants in certain regions because the climate is favorable, and if we try to raise some other plants, it may not be so favorable. But if the climate changes, those plants that have been well adapted to our current location may, in fact, lose some of their growth and reproductive function. So, for instance, excessively high temperatures can damage corn pollen, reduce their viability, and therefore lead to ears that are not filled, or as happened in Michigan with the tart cherry crop, unseasonable spring freeze events can kill the blossoms and destroy, almost completely destroy the tart cherry production a few years back. So just as a little cartoon structure here, this shows what I'm trying to convey here in terms of physiological limits. We think about the trend in climate and variability of climate. And so we'll look at these and see how both of these are important considerations moving forward. So if we think about the trend, there are long-term trends. We know that the temperatures in our region, summertime temperatures have been going up, wintertime temperatures going up even more. But if we think about the growing season, the temperatures have been a bit on the rise, and this could be a cause for reduced yield or even crop failure because of kernel counts may be reduced because of pollination issues. Increased humidity generally favors pests and pathogens, fungus, mold, and so on. It can be more prevalent in humid environments, and our humidity in Iowa has gone up by something like 13% over the last 20, 30 years. And meat animal production is challenged because of high temperatures can reduce grain weight, and similar production problems arise in poultry and milk cows as well. So an isolated heat wave, for instance, we interviewed some growers, vineyards owners in California. They put a limit on temperature that they can have in their grapes of 105 degrees Fahrenheit, because beyond that it just reduces the the ultimate wine quality. So they're very, very sensitive to any even small rise in temperature in a climate that is already quite warm. And they're actually having to move their vineyards, relocate vineyards because of these increased temperatures. But also an extended period of high nighttime temperatures could reduce opportunities for milk cows to recover from the daily heat and therefore lead to a reduction in milk production. So it isn't only daytime temperature or average temperature, it's also nighttime temperature. But also increased variability can lead to situations where plants or animals are exposed to conditions that are quite unfavorable for short periods of time. But when we add together increased trend and increased variability, we get an even more significant challenge, because these events which exceed the physiological limit can be more frequent and last for longer periods of time. And so for instance, a 6-day heat wave would have a more adverse effect than 2-3-day heat wave separated by 2 normal days. Or anytime we extend that period, the recovery is more difficult, and both humans and animals have difficulties with these extended heat waves, which are projected to be more frequent in the future. So as we think about moving forward, and as kind of an overarching theme, it's clear that heterogeneous landscapes and landscapes that to the extent possible use native plants are more natural and more resilient to extremes. And this photograph is from Australia, in fact, but it does show some of the landscapes that were more prevalent in the western, even in the Dakotas and Nebraska after the Dust Bowl, where shelter belts were planted and to control movement of soil and to reduce wind speed and allow plants to be growing in a more favorable microclimate. And so those shelter belts have now pretty much been removed, and so we are back to a less heterogeneous and less resilient landscape that we should think about moving forward as these challenges due to climate change become more intense. So the motivation for adaptation, there could be various reasons. Profitability surely is one of the first. Productivity also, we've been pushing systems to really enhance productivity, but stewardship also becomes an issue. And I want to just talk briefly about that, because we did some interviews with producers in different parts of the country, and we asked them about their practices. We were given their names because they were acknowledged as being leaders in developing sustainable practices in row crop agriculture, and in another interview was in rangeland production, and the third was in a vineyard in California. And these are the common themes that these early adopters of sustainable practices were the themes that were common to all three of these very diverse producers. They all agreed there's a need to employ sustainable practices that protect soil. Soil is really key, and so we have to think of soil as its own ecosystem. It's one producer said it's his underground livestock, and the microbes and so on are things that he thinks about in terms of how he manages soil. Family considerations in connection with their sustainable management practices were considered. 2 of the 3 of these were long-term family operations. The grazing operation in Nebraska and Selma, Nebraska was I think a 4th-generation ranching operation that they had gone through the Dust Bowl. They had, in some cases, in some parts of their land, had lost 2 or 3 feet of topsoil. But the land recovered because they were using native grasses that Took a long time to get reestablished, but she talked about reading the grasses and then adapting their management practices based on what they were seeing from their long association with these native grasses. Pride and leadership in their use of sustainable practices was also a common theme among these three producers. They gave very active attention to change within their climate and their land. They were very, very keenly aware of the soil, of the changes in the soil, of how the soil was responding under different conditions, and how they could work with the soil under periods of when it was being challenged to not put additional stress on the system when they could see that it was already being impacted. And they were always looking for new methods and new ways to introduce practices that could work with the crops and the soil in order to maintain a resilient landscape. We can talk about adaptation strategies at different levels, and you can think about it different levels of effort, different levels of investment. And so we can think of it, we divide it up, or sociologists have divided it up into three increasing levels of intensity of adaptation: resistance, resilience, and transformation. We'll take just a look at these individually. Resistance is a response that allows a manager to continue the current practices with some minimal change. It might involve adjusting insurance that is purchased. It might involve purchasing seed that's more drought tolerant, or maybe shifting from crop maybe more soybeans, which are a little bit more heat tolerant, or some process like that, or some change of strategy like that would not be a major effort to introduce radically different crops or to have major investments in other ways. If we go to resilience, however, then we're talking about changing practices that may involve higher investment. So this should be thought of then as one of the options, and we see this more when we've talked with producers who have family operations who are thinking about the next generation, that they see making investments as not only a one-season activity, but something that is a part of a longer-term plan to build resilience into the landscape. And so I'm written here, building resilience. Climate change consists of taking action to protect yields as well as soil resources and the agricultural infrastructure that might be needed even if these changes become more extreme. Examples would be, in some cases, cover crops. Now, that's not a huge investment, but it might be something that is done pervasively over a large area. Contour planting on slopes to protect fields against soil erosion might be another. And if we look to the more significant effort and investment, in some cases, primarily at the margins of acknowledged growing regions in the U.S. And I'll show an example of the edge of the Corn Belt, for instance, where changes are more extreme or more put plants at higher vulnerability. The transformation is what we label this. It recognizes that past practices are just no longer profitable or environmentally sustainable, and that there's a need to have a major shift in land management in order to continue operating the land and drawing an income from the land and maintaining its integrity. An example would be changing from irrigated agriculture to row crop from irrigated row crop agriculture to rangeland agriculture, or perhaps even changing from irrigated to agriculture to a much more drought-tolerant crop, for instance, maybe sorghum instead of corn. Just an example of this is a paper we published a couple of years ago in this economics journal, where we looked at corn yields and corn yield changes across the acknowledged corn belt throughout the U.S. And on this plot, there are 4 panels. Each of them is a corn yield under a different global climate scenario. So the upper left is a global climate model of the Canadian Climate Center, and the right-hand side is the Australian Climate Center model. The lower left is the German, and the lower right is the Japanese model. And the upper left and lower right are the little drier models. That is, they produce a climate for the middle of the current century that is a little drier than the other 2 climates in the upper right and lower left. Now, if you look at these graphs, red is loss of baseline production. That is a major reduction in yield for corn in these regions that are shown in red. Yellow is also a reduction, but not as high as in the red zone. Increases in yields are shown by the greens and blues, and you don't see many greens and blues for the middle of the current century. So around the 2050s, there may be some new land coming into production in North Dakota, northern Minnesota, maybe some sprinklings around the Great Lakes region. And oddly enough, some even down in Oklahoma or Arkansas, which we're still thinking about just how that might be possible. But the takeaway message is that it's those regions that are already kind of on the margins that are going to be highly impacted. And that shouldn't be surprising, but these models are consistent in showing that the western corn belt is the one that's most at risk for major climate change impacts by the middle of the 21st century. And therefore, these are areas where producers might think about their long-term strategies about if they are intensively managing corn in these regions, it might be something to consider about the long-term viability. Well, let's just look at some of the changes that are occurring and some of the strategies for adaptation that are already being done or that are being promoted. Let's look at excessive rainfall. This has certainly been a problem here in Iowa. A couple of years ago, we had 700,000 acres in northern Iowa that were not planted to anything because they couldn't get into the fields in the spring. Just the excessive rain day after day reduced the number of field work days, delayed planting. Those areas that were planted, there were seeds were yellowed because of the waterlogging of the soils. Again, above the physiological limit for plants to grow, and so therefore it was a significant challenge. In less severe cases, planting grass waterways where small streams develop, this is a key thing that needs to be done. Contour farming, residue and tillage management are other ways to make adaptations in coping with this excess rainfall. Excessive heat, cases there, probably more in southern Corn Belt into southern Missouri and into the Great Plains. The higher temperatures for reduced times or at key periods in the pollen producing period can reduce pollen viability. There can be stressed plants, decreased seed weight because the plants just are not able to transpire to keep up and keep that plant temperature down to the within the acceptable range. So producers are planting earlier, they're planting seeds with different pollination periods, and they're purchasing heat-tolerant seeds. Higher humidity, as I said, and we see this in Iowa, humidity has gone up substantially. We're seeing more dew on crops and longer periods of dew. And so, for instance, there's a lot of dew on the soybeans in the fall, and so harvest can't begin in the day until maybe 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning because there's so much dew has accumulated over the nighttime period with higher humidity. So it shortens the effective harvest period. More pests and pathogens are showing up because of they're more favored by these high humidity conditions. Farmers are producing larger equipment so that they can wider bean heads for their machinery so that they can harvest more in a shorter period of time, and purchasing seed varieties that are more tolerant to these new pests and pathogens that are showing up. Extreme winds, hail, another factor that is likely to accompany climate change, summertime situations where we're putting actually more heat into the system, and anytime you turn the heat up on a pan of boiling water, you're going to get more action, more activity, more thermodynamic changes, and that's what we see in convective thunderstorms. So we can get plant damage due to green snap or hail. It's, although I don't know that we have good evidence yet that hail frequencies are increasing, but it's very likely because of the fact that we have more water in the atmospheric system, and so there's going to be more water coming out in both liquid and forms of hail. Also, there's vulnerability to aflatoxin. If we have multiple stresses to plants, drought following plant damage is one that's traditionally watched as a potential for development of aflatoxin. Producers are adapting where possible, buying seeds with higher resistance to green snap, considering a higher level of crop insurance to cope with increasing frequency of such events. Cover crops are one that have multiple benefits, and there's a lot of resources that are available for this. USDA has done a wonderful job of creating this. It's not only a cover crop chart, but it's a lengthy document that each one of these species has a write-up on its characteristics and how it might help with trapping nutrients and keeping nutrients from moving away from the landscape, of rooting, how good it is at rooting and creating favorable conditions for a grass waterway, or other factors, keeping nutrients in the field and not running out. So if you're considering any kind of situation, you might want to go to this document. You can just Google cover crop chart USDA and it'll come up. It's a good document. Another tool of adaptation is shelter belts. These were used in the plains, Great Plains in the 40s and 50s, and have now largely disappeared, but they're used widely. This photo is from Australia. There you see multiple. You see livestock, you see grazing taking place within a very well-managed, very closely spaced shelter belt network where you get multiple benefits and you protect the soil from erosive characteristics of wind or moving water. And so these are can be very helpful in establishing and maintaining soil integrity to increasing challenges. We also have, in this case, fruit crops with agricultural crops. This one is from China, and of course this involves more small equipment and labor, more hand labor, maybe more adapted to a society where that has a high labor force available for these kinds of crops, but there may be some analogs that we might be thinking of in the U.S. central region, particularly for those that already have a high-value crop program going on their farms. Grass waterways, as I've indicated, are very valuable in areas prone to these more intense rain events, and we've had a lot of those in Iowa, and I've even seen situations just like this where the day after a very intensive rain, where a grass waterway was installed and managed for the last 30 or 40 years has now been shown to be inadequate because the width of the stream that occurred after a very intense rain event was twice the width of the grass waterway. And so the grass waterway did its job, but the problem was it just wasn't wide enough, and I saw big trenches having been developed outside of the grass waterway that was established years ago. So in some cases it's an updating, it's adapting to the more recent changes that we're experiencing. Livestock producers also have been active in adaptation strategies, and there may be a more intense need for that in the future as well, as higher daytime temperatures are causing discomfort for cattle. They tend to go off feed, as we say, or we used to say, or limit their feed intake because they are reducing their metabolism. The high feed intake drives body temperatures higher, and so that's a counterproductive measure for them in a higher temperature environment. So more shading, more misting stations to allow better comfort for animals is needed. And those indoor confinement, there's more of a need for rethinking ventilation systems and ability to maintain temperatures within ranges that are suitable for animals, confinement animals. As far as managing landscapes, again, our interviews with this one rancher indicated that they are very careful about using native grasses to the extent possible, to migrating or changing their grazing patterns to protect the integrity of the plants, the long-term integrity of the plants, and to, if there are favorable conditions in the spring, they may adjust and take more hay off the land rather than graze, or use some other combination of hay harvest and grazing and simply resting the land in order to maintain the long-term integrity. But taking a multi-year approach seemed to be the strategy that was being followed. Another factor that I want to just talk about very briefly is the use of climate information on a variety of different scales to more effectively manage systems within the season and for multiple seasons. And one of the products of our U2U project was this, and it just kind of graphically illustrates the kind of decisions that producers make. So we have several rings here. The outer ring is a calendar, and the inner ring is the same calendar, but it shows what decisions are made and when that decision has its impact. So, for instance, a corn producer might be purchasing seed in February. Now, it might be January or December, but I just use this for illustration. Suppose they purchased a seed in February. Well, the decision they make there they have to think about when they're going to plant and what density they're going to plant, when they're going to harvest, and what kind of summer they think they might have. Is it going to be a drought-prone summer? Is it going to be excessive rainfall? That might influence what kind of seed you purchase. So you make that without a lot of future information, and then the impact is shown on the inner calendar where it gives the tillage and the plant the compaction and so on that might be impacted by the decision you make to purchase that seed in February. So it's it shows various practices and then the length of time between when that decision is made and the outcome. Now the length of the arrow is the time period of a forecast. If the climate scientists and meteorologists could create a unique forecast for some particular event, such as fall fertilization here, should you fertilize in the fall or should you wait till the spring? That impacts, you would like to know whether there's going to be frozen soil during this whole overwintering period. And so the challenge to the meteorological community is to try to make forecasts that are specific enough to provide advice for producers on their choices that they're making back here in November, whether or not to put on fall fertilization. So it's a within the season forecast that there's a lot of intensive work in the meteorological community on this, and but we need more input from producers as to the very type of decisions they make and their needs for these long-term forecasts. If we go, we can go to multi-year decisions that marketing and machinery purchase are based on what the seasonal outlook would be, but also the long-term outlook. Do we have some type of event, type of climate condition that's going to extend for 18 months? If so, that might make a decision on how I market my grain. If we look at even longer, 1 to 3 years or even 3 to 5, we talk about rental contracts, introducing grass waterways, use of cover crops would be decisions that would depend on what we believe the changes in climate will be. And even longer, 5 to 20 years, we have decisions on estate planning, land purchase, installation of major landscape changes such as drainage tile or contours. So it's just a way of thinking about these decisions that are made and the time scale for these decisions and the kind of information, climate information that producers really need. Not that the meteorological community is very good at this yet in many cases, but at least we need this dialogue. We need this challenging back and forth of the producers to the meteorological community to come up with better ways. And this is just a insert here to show what these the length of these arrows really is. So in some cases, major transformation may really be needed on the landscape. And so one that I've been thinking about recently, because I've been doing a lot of work with the wind turbines and their impact on agriculture, find that on balance, wind turbines are probably favorable for agriculture. But we might think about solar panels too, as we're thinking about taking a long-term view. There's a lot of interest now in renewable energy, and agriculture producers have a lot of land that could be used for, could be doubly used for solar and wind as well as agriculture, grazing or crops. So. And what it does is it produces, it brings back some heterogeneity that you could think about in terms of what a wind turbine does, or a wind farm is really has some of the same effects as the shelter belts of the 1940s and 50s. That is, it reduces the wind speed, it has beneficial effects on the crops in terms of allowing more light penetration into the crops because there's more turbulence that's produced over the crop, and has several benefits. So let's just take a look at that in kind of closing out here. This is a photograph from China where, again, it's more of a high labor operation, but you can see that here crops were grown multi-cropped with trees for presumably wood or maybe even some sort of nut crop might be considered. If we think about memories of the Dust Bowl, these are some horrendous events that occurred and loss and major loss of topsoil, leading to situations that just left the landscape totally changed and unproductive for many years. That are there ways that we can build a landscape that is resilient to these kinds of situations? So again, I show a more heterogeneous landscape, use of trees, natural plants, but also maybe even wind turbines, where we have the potential to reduce wind speed, to protect the crops from these and the soil from these extreme events. And so we should give thought to something like this. From our research and impact of turbines on crops, we've measured some of these. These questions here or issues were just from our discussions with agronomists, that turbines will reduce the daytime maximum temperature very slightly, maybe a half a degree or so, so it's not a whole lot, at least under normal conditions, maybe more under extreme conditions. But that could avoid summertime moisture stress. In green here, indicating it's a good thing. Not all effects of turbines are good. It might even increase respiration at night with higher nighttime temperatures. They would enhance evaporation, which would reduce the dew period during high dew events, because there would be more stirring of the air. On the other hand, it could also accelerate moisture loss during a drought. So these are the good and bad things that the agronomists had hypothesized would happen if we had very large wind farms co-located with intensively managed agriculture. For a couple of reasons, there are likely enhanced photosynthesis because of higher carbon dioxide exchange with the crop, and this we actually have measured, that during the daytime when wind turbines are active, there is more carbon dioxide uptake by the crops. It could be more CO2 pumped from the soil during the daytime, which would enhance photosynthesis, and moving the plants causes more light penetration deeper into the canopy, so more leaves become engaged in photosynthesis. We might think about in the western U.S., reduced wind speed might be good for grazing animals, for protecting the soil. Increased snow deposition. We found that these turbines will, by slowing the wind, will very likely add to increased snow deposition. Deeper mixing of cool air from above during heat waves. We haven't a lot of data on this, but we can speculate from what we know about meteorological conditions during these extreme temperature events that it's probably going to cool the surface some. And it could be actually lead to warmer surface conditions in the early spring and maybe get the growing season started a little bit earlier. So in balance, we could say that wind turbines may have some of the same positive effects as shelter belts are known to have. Well, there are a lot of resources, and so I point you to this recent book, Resilient Agriculture, which gives a wide range of anecdotes, stories about adaptation strategies that farmers have actually used all over the U.S., and it's a very recent book, and I think it's a very well-written book. The worst hard time is recounting of some of the conditions during the Dust Bowl. It's good reading to know these are events that have happened in the past. If it's happened before, it could happen again. And so it's good to know what these extreme events can lead to. Some economic benefits of shelter belts. This is an Australian publication. I've got the website down here that you can see. And then finally, this cover crop chart, which I previously mentioned, and you can Google from USDA. So in summary, climate change will have a major impact on the north central region. Higher temperatures and amplification of current precipitation extremes are very likely scenarios, and so we should look at these. We should learn from these events as they come along, and we should look at some of these events that occurred in the past. will our landscapes be resilient to withstand these kind of challenges in the future? Multiple land use scenarios will build resilience for future scenarios. So thinking about using a couple, 2 or 3 strategies will be better than relying on a single one. And it may be that landscape transformation may be required where some of these modest resistance or resilience changes are really insufficient to cope with climate change. And more resources are becoming available, and I would hope that you would take advantage of some of these. So that's what I have to say today, and I'll take some questions.
Okay, thanks, Gene. Yeah, now we've got a few minutes to do some question and answer. We'll also bring up a couple survey questions, sort of be in the sidebar that you can fill out as well. If you have a question, you can go ahead and type it into the Q&A box or type it into the chat box, and just make sure you either send it to everyone or to myself and I can see that. Or if you want to go ahead and be unmuted, just type into one of the boxes, hey, I want to be unmuted, and you can just ask your question over the audio. So with that, I will go ahead and let anyone that has questions go ahead and jump in. If not, you can see that the poll question is opened up. We'll leave that open for a couple minutes, so you can type in there just the short answer, as you can see the question there. Then once that short answer question is done, we have a couple more questions which are very short and easy to answer as well. So in the meantime, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask. Looks like there's one question here in the chat box, Gene. I'm not sure if you can see this. It's from David. It says, you've shown examples of impacts from current climate variability. What adaptation strategies are appropriate for producers in anticipation of projected future climate? So, Gene, if you have a response to that question.
Yeah, so that's why we need to be, and that's one of the reasons for the National Climate Assessment is to know what we are adapting to. What are the challenges? Is it a humidity problem? Is it mold in your basement, or is it that you're not able to store your grain? It's getting because of the higher humidity, and so we have to really identify what the challenge is, and then look at what strategies might be available. So it may be cover crops, it may be a better storage facility or a different marketing strategy. It really depends on the particular challenge that you're facing, and but these are opportunities then too to learn more and to ask questions about whether these extremes that we're experiencing are one-off kinds of things, or is this something that we're going to be needing in the future. So it's really very specific to the particular extreme that's being experienced.
Okay, thanks, Gene. Anyone else have any questions? Please feel free to jump in or type into the Q&A box or the chat box, and we can get those brought up to Gene. You'll notice the poll question. We'll leave that open for just a little bit longer, so if you want to type in there, and then we'll go ahead and pull up the last couple questions after that. So anyway, if anyone has more questions, we'll go ahead and remain here on the line, wait for questions if anyone has any. Gene, I do have one question. Oh, I'll go ahead and mention that the new poll questions are up. There are 5 quick short answer questions, or multiple choice questions you can answer. It'll take just a few seconds. But Gene, I do have one more question. You mentioned the developing forecasts specifically for farmer decisions in a timely manner. Are you aware of any projects or anything that NOAA or anything else that might be doing for maybe addressing those specific questions that the ag community might have, and more specific forecasts long term?
Yeah, let me just speak briefly. I'm not an expert on this. I think Dennis Toddy and Jeff Andreessen are better equipped to answer this, but El Nino is now become well established as we know how the El Nino's basic mechanisms. What we don't know is how intense they will be, how frequently they will return, and how long they're going to last. So, but that kind of information I think is quite useful, even though the signal or the impact specifically attributable to El Nino is somewhat muted in our region. There are perhaps management decisions that might be made. And so we're currently have been in one of the strongest El Ninos in recent memory, and it's certainly having some impact in California and in the southern states. Less so, and it's been of course, the winter season here, so not the growing season, but moving on into the growing season, if the El Nino persists, and that's still up for debate, but if we do get better El Nino forecasting tools, I think that could have an impact on farmers' choices of what to plant, what plant density to establish, maybe setting up their disease management for the summer. So I think that's an example of where a seasonal forecast would be of high value to agriculture.
Okay, thanks. If anyone typed in a question into the chat box and you don't have me listed as someone that can view that question, I might not be able to see that. I see that Laura may have put a question in the chat box and I'm not seeing it. So Gene, I'm not sure if you can see a question in the chat box or not.
No, I'm not seeing anything.
Okay. So Laura, maybe if you want to type into the Q&A, I'll be able to see that. Rebecca Powers has a question. You mentioned some changes in corn production from climate projections. Are there any similarities for soybean production in the region?
Yes, we did soybean production, but it was for only one cultivar of soybeans, and so the results are fairly limited. But I could share that with Rebecca if she's interested. We did corn, we did soybeans, we did rice and cotton and wheat. So actually, the wheat might be interested in for producers in the western part of the north central region. But if anyone's interested in that, I can give you the link to it, or the link is on that slide that I showed. So that would be the quick way. If they have access to the presentation, they could get it off that slide, or send me an email.
And that was actually Laura's question that Rebecca typed in. And there was a webinar yesterday. I don't know the exact title, but it's from the USDA talking about water scarcity and climate projections. And they, again, I don't have all the details on that right in front of me, but they went over some projections of different crops and increases or decreases in the yields. Of course, that's a projection 50 years out, but they went into at least a few more crops than corn or soybeans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of information coming available, so I think it's good to stay in touch. Producers should stay in touch with their extension service, state extension services, and the extension folks really need to be on top of these rapidly changing sources of information.
Okay. Looks like the poll just getting some feedback somewhere along the way. There we go. I think we got it done. Anyway, yeah, if anyone else has any more questions, I think the poll is completed. With that, if I don't see any more questions, I definitely could be missing something here somewhere. Let me see. It looks like there is one more question. I think Hans asked a question, as climate change events occur, will this improve models over time?
Yes, we are using extreme events that occur, as we're moving forward. Hurricane Sandy, for instance, was a real learning experience for, these are short-term models, of course, but anything we learn in the short term, these extreme events can be translated into the long-term climate models as well, because it's the same basic models that are used for day-to-day weather forecasting that are used for decadal and century-long climate simulation. So the models are improving. There are certain internal mechanisms in the model of feedbacks that we call that we use are improved because we're seeing more of these extreme events.
Okay, thanks. And then there was a comment, not so much as a question, from Phil Sutton, that we also have to decide what crops are going to be grown. We may be getting more vegetables because the Southwest will become water needy. So it was more of a comment, I guess, than a question.
Well, that's a good point, that we ought to be watching what's happening in other areas. For instance, as I pointed out, in California, some areas, Cabernet production is just being suspended because temperatures are getting too high. So these are moving elsewhere. We see a huge increase in the hop production in Iowa, for instance, or at least the interest in hop production, because, again, the other regions may not be favorable, and there's a huge demand now because of all the microbreweries to raise hops. So there may be some high-value crops that we should think about for as we experiment toward a more sustainable future, to be looking at some of these alternative crops.
Okay, thanks, Gene. Had a question about the PowerPoint, if it's available to print off. I guess we hadn't decided that. I know, Gene, if this is something that you're willing or want to send out to be able to be printed off, or a PDF version, or if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I can prepare one. I'll probably add a few attributions and so on, but yes, we can do that.
Okay. Yeah, and we'll put that on the website once that's completed for the climateagwater.wordpress.com. And we'll have also the recording to this as well on there. So you should be able to check back there shortly and find both of those. I guess if there's nothing else there, I appreciate everyone joining in, and thanks, Gene, for doing the webinar today. We definitely appreciate that. We'll be back here next month, March 28th at 1 p.m. Central Time for webinar number 3, looking primarily on water management. So thanks all for joining today, and we look forward to having everyone back on next month.